webinar, Expanding and Sustaining Leadership to Make Progress. A few housekeeping items before we start. All of your phone lines are muted to reduce background noise. Please use your phone for audio and make sure to use your audio pin so that your lines can be unmuted to participate in discussion. You might need to click the telephone button in the audio pane to receive your audio pin. Please make sure your speakers are turned off or muted to help eliminate background noise. We have posted the webinar slides on the SharePoint calendar should you want to print them off and take notes, and they're also located under Resources in the HCI Webinar Slides and Documents folder. Finally, the webinar will be recorded and will be archived on SharePoint along with the final slide presentation should it change. We will begin with a short presentation, and time will be set aside throughout for questions and participant discussion. Please feel free to use the chat box on the right side of your screen to type in any questions that you might have. Sean will close with announcements about upcoming events and due dates. Our presenters today are Scott and Joyce with CCSR. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeff.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our monthly webinar. As you know, we won't have one in October because we will be having our Healthy Communities meeting. We're really looking forward to that, and I hope everyone else is looking forward to attending that meeting. Welcome. I hope everyone is enjoying the, finally, it looks like fall weather has come to Kansas, and I'm looking forward to it. With that, I'm just going to turn it over to Joyce and Scott.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. As Adrian mentioned, today's webinar focuses really on the human capital necessary for a successful coalition or leadership team. And CCSR and others have had experiences in working with a lot of coalitions and community-based groups, and we recognize that it's important to attend to this human capital, if you will, that it's important to be on the lookout for how to expand leadership to get others involved in the work of the coalition or the community group, and how to sustain that leadership over time. And so throughout today's webinar, we'll be providing some helpful information about coalition leadership, a couple of tools that are provided and I think have already been sent in advance related to the importance of preparing for secessions in coalitions. So when people decide to move off of a coalition, how can the other coalitions prepare for that secession or that change in leadership and avoid future headaches? And then certainly, as Adrian mentioned, there'll be time for discussion and networking. We're going to begin with a scenario, and this scenario should have been sent in advance. So if you have it either printed or electronically, feel free to pull it up. I'll briefly summarize the scenario, and then we'll ask a few of the participants to respond. We're going to unmute them and allow them to respond. And then we'll also open up the chat box, or the chat box is free to be open for other thoughts and comments related to the scenario. And the scenario begins with a coalition, the Forever Kansas Health Coalition. It's been in existence for about 6 years, and it was started by a health department, local hospitals, and a few others who recognized that their county was one of the unhealthiest counties in Kansas based on some rankings that came out related to counties and how healthy they are. So they've been trying to do some awareness type events over those several years. They've done a 5K run, a Celebrate Forever Kansas, some food and clothing drives. And they've also reached out to other communities to learn about how do they spread the message about being a healthy community and what types of efforts other communities have been involved in. through those connections with other communities, they recognize the importance of local policies, especially those related to streets and sidewalks, and that those could be examined in their own community to improve healthy walking, biking, running, and jogging, and those types of opportunities. And so given that focus, one of the focuses of their coalition is to focus on these types of policies. They recognize it'd be useful to have the county manager involved in the coalition, in the Forever Kansas Health Coalition. So one of the coalition members visited with the county manager and asked that he join the coalition to get more informed about what they're working on. And due to that connection, the county manager RSVP'd and attended the coalition meeting in September. The agenda had not been finalized yet for the September meeting, but several of the core members of the coalition knew that it was critical to engage the county manager and provide an opportunity for him to get involved, to get more engaged. They recognized that the county government was a hard nut to crack, if you will. So be thinking about what advice would you give to the coalition to engage this county manager? What would be running through your mind in how to approach him during this September meeting that he has RSVP'd to? What would be going on in your head? How would you consider to engage him? Or what would be the most important thing to do? Give that a few minutes. I'm not going to open up the mic yet. And then I'm going to tell the rest of the story and what you might do then. So get some thoughts. How would you engage that county manager? How would you welcome him or get him involved in the coalition's work? So the rest of the story. The manager does attend in September. He listens intensely during the discussion, as he's known for that. And he seems fairly engaged in the conversation. He also attends the October and November meetings. But as the discussion leads more and more to potential policy changes that would impact some decisions he may have to make in the future, all of a sudden, in December, the manager does not attend. Of course, it's the holiday season, and he's a busy guy. But then in January and February, he does not attend either. Several of the core members are questioning what might be going on. So now, some questions, and I'm going to open up the line for Susan and Chris, who hopefully are both with us, to respond with their initial thoughts about what interpretations they may have related to why the county manager may no longer be participating. And then the second question would be, what would be possible experiments you might suggest to this coalition to try to engage that county manager? And so Chris Tilden from Lawrence and Susan Luquega from Livermore, thanks for joining. Hopefully you are unmuted now. And I'd like to hear from you, what are possible experiments or what are possible interpretations you might have as to why the county manager is no longer attending. And then secondly, what experiments you might try or suggest the coalition try. Susan or Chris, do you have any thoughts for us?
This is Susan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. My first thoughts were that possibly, and we've had experience like this, that potentially, maybe not just for the county manager, but that the situation was not explained clearly. Like, you know, the coalition obviously understood what was going on and all the things that they've been working on, but one, maybe the situation was not explained clearly on how they got to the point where they were. And then possibly that there were not clear next steps that were explained, and so at the first meeting, perhaps it wasn't clear what the next steps were going to be. And then also another thing was that the time and process that was going to be involved, because the manager came, it seems like the manager came to the first meeting, but then as time went by, that's when he seemed to become less engaged. And so to that end, I don't know if Chris wants to respond to that part, but my suggestion, and it's not just me because our coalition has done this, but to that end, possible experiments would be to, not just for the manager, but for everybody to show, to explain clearly what the situation is and what is in it for the county manager specifically, what is in it in this situation for the county to be involved, what's in it for the county, and then what is in it for the county manager himself, and maybe go as far as, since he hasn't attended these last two meetings, to go, maybe to have one or two people go to his office and ask him what are the priorities, become familiar with the priorities of the county, what are the priorities of the county have in relationship to the health of the community in terms of the streets and sidewalks, and then come from that angle in terms of engaging him and bringing him back.
Well, thanks, Susan. It sounds like, some of your interpretations might be there was a lack of clarity about the purpose of the coalition or the direction or the mission of the coalition. And also I heard in there maybe there was a lack of clarity of next steps or what was going to be done next. And then before I turn it over to Chris for any of his possible interpretations and experiments, it sounded like you mentioned this might be a time not only to revisit with the county manager, but others as part of the coalition. What is the purpose of the coalition? And then more specifically related to the county manager, why participation might be important to him, connecting to where he sees the county's interest and future activities, how it fits in with the larger coalition's purpose, and to do that request at his office. So thanks for sharing. Chris, I want to turn it over to you now for your thoughts about possible interpretations as to why he may have stopped attending, and then experiments that you might want to consider. Chris, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Thanks, Chris. Any thoughts?
Well, I don't know that I think my thoughts would in large part reflect, what Susan had to share. We did have a situation with in one of our community coalitions where we were concerned about a specific partner that represented a large and influential sector of our community that we wanted engaged in this process. And much as she said, we thought one of the experiments or one of the steps to try was that initial one-on-one outreach, to talk about their priorities, to talk about potential barriers to their participation in the work. It's someone that had been engaged pretty significantly for a period of time, but then for a variety of reasons, was no longer engaged in the work, despite the fact we felt we were at a pretty opportune time in terms of strategic policy and systems issues that we were hoping to address with them at the table. As part of that process, I think we learned, that this while we felt we had a fairly diverse coalition, I think we recognized in discussions with this individual that other key decision makers that he felt were integral to our ability to move these issues forward were not represented in that discussion. We actually ended up broadening participation to include other key stakeholders that heretofore, for a variety of reasons, we hadn't engaged in that process. So he recommitted to not only the participation, but also provided us, I think, with some valuable perspective that we think have enhanced our collaboration as a whole, have brought some new players to the table. And I think in that process that has made him feel more accountable, since other colleagues and stakeholders that he values as partners in our community are also part of the dialogue.
Well, it sounds like, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong, what may have been a missed opportunity to allow that person kind of to drift away from the coalition turned out to be not only engaging with him, but then he brought others to the table, and he says, I think these are important voices to have as part of the coalition. And so he was an asset then to the coalition beyond himself, it sounds like.
Oh, absolutely. So I always think there's utility in asking those, open-ended questions about, how and in what way can we, best include your voice in this discussion and best engage the community, including your organization. And so that perspective absolutely not only brought him back to the table, but I think has added value in a significant way to our work.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks to both of you for sharing. I'm also seeing it looks like somebody maybe typed in the county manager may need to see some action or some results. Sometimes it's typical, not only of county or city leaders, that if they're getting involved in something, they want to see steps being taken and follow through. So it sounds like one person's possible interpretation is maybe there needs to be some action, some follow-through, some small wins, if you will, so that the county manager sees that progress is being made. And I'm sure we've come across those action-oriented people in our lives who will only get involved if things are happening. So that's another possible interpretation and to make. Well, thanks both Chris and Susan for sharing. We're now going to turn over and do a polling question. And so this will be an opportunity for everybody to answer a question. And it's not a challenging question, but an opportunity to respond with your thoughts and suggestions. Based on what Chris and Susan are saying, some of the Kansas Leadership Center competencies seem to be at play when trying to expand and engage others. Those competencies, as you remember, are about diagnosing the situation, managing oneself, energizing others, and intervening skillfully. And so we're going to do a poll now, and Joyce, if you want to pull up that poll, we'll, or is it Adrian, you can pull up the poll? I'm sorry.
Yep, I just launched the poll.
Okay.
So we can give people a few minutes to respond.
So hopefully you're able to see the poll question of which of the following TLC leadership competencies is most critical for expanding leadership? And then there's, of course, the 4 answers: diagnose situation, manage self, energize others, and intervene skillfully. We'll give, as Adrian mentioned, a few minutes to respond to that poll.
And we have 85% have voted. Maybe just a little bit longer.
Okay.
Okay. That might be it, Scott.
All right, great. Well, I feel like a game show host on Facebook asking, and survey says. So, Adrian, are you able to respond to where people felt was the most critical aspect of expanding leadership based on the TLC competencies?
Yes. Well, it was a tie with 53% each for diagnose situation and energize others, 6% for manage self, and 41% for intervene skillfully. And I will go ahead and close the poll.
Great. Well, and not surprisingly, you might guess, based on the responses from Chris and from Susan, many of these competencies are at play, and the subpoints of them are at play, of having and also likely technical aspects of a coalition, as well as adaptive aspects related to the coalition. And so I'm going to touch upon a couple of those and refer back to, I think, some comments that both Chris and Susan made, as well as some of the thoughts that have come in via the questions and the chat box. Some of what I've heard related to technical issues, and if you'll remember, technical issues are defined as those types of issues where there's a defined problem and a defined solution, and one can go to an expert or somebody who has expertise with it. Adaptive issues, as you may remember, are those that there's not a defined solution, there's no defined problem, or it's very gray or hard to understand what the problem is, and therefore you have to engage others to determine what the pathway is or how to make progress on it. And so kind of in general, using those two kind of concepts of technical and adaptive, it seems like some of the technical issues potentially at play might be related to the structure and the function of the coalition. So I think there was some mention in Susan's comment about how the coalition is structured, and given the role of the county manager and what he is involved in, does the structure meet his schedule, if you will? I also heard the notion of having next steps or goals in mind and who needs to accomplish those goals. And so a technical aspect of a coalition might be to regularly track the accomplishments of the coalition, helping keep pace on a month-to-month basis, who is doing what. I also heard broader than just those goals, the notion of having a clear purpose or vision or mission in mind. And does that need to be revisited not only with the county manager, but potentially with others? And then one other kind of technical related idea was around doing some type of faction or stakeholder map, potentially. And I think, Chris, you didn't mention those words specifically, but alluded to the notion of involving others in the conducting and understanding others who may have an interest in the issue. some of the adaptive issues at hand, excuse me, might also be at play, and I think, again, Susan and Chris referred to these in different ways. But where are the strengths and energy among those coalition members? And so does the coalition, does the county manager have certain strengths or energies that, given that he doesn't know the purpose, that aren't being deployed? And Chris, I think your example in particular, where that member dropped off, he had certain strengths and connections that maybe weren't being capitalized on that could have been. Some other things that could be at play, I'm not too sure if Chris or Susan mentioned these specifically, but in a coalition or in a community group, there certainly are differences in power among those stakeholders, people who hold different positions in the community. And so how are discussions around the different voices and level of authority taken into account? And does everybody feel like, even though they may not have as much authority or power in the community, an opportunity for their voice and their input to be heard as part of the coalition, that their voice is relevant? Another area that I'll touch upon is about previous competition among coalition members. And while often coalitions and community groups gather for the common good or to collaborate, we mustn't forget that sometimes there can be previous or current competition for resources, for personnel, or for other assets. And it's important to acknowledge those types of interests, whether it's as part of the coalition meeting or potentially one-on-one among coalition members. One of the things with these ideas in mind, and I'll turn it over to Joyce if she has any other comments or thoughts related to these ideas, is we've found that a big part of the success of coalitions is creating that safe space for people to share their thoughts, for a shared vision to be developed, and for that vision to be nourished or maintained. That probably about 70% of the success of a coalition is responding and creating that safe space for those coalition members, recognizing they're the capital that makes the coalition proceed. About 30% of it is still related to structure, follow-through, and some of those technical aspects of a coalition, if you will. So it's not to dismiss those technical aspects, but in general, what we found is that creating that safe space is really key for the long-term success of the coalition. Joyce, do you have any other thoughts from this first part of the webinar?
I don't, but I am curious if anybody, I haven't seen any more comments in the chat box, but I'm curious about your sense of or experience with those adaptive aspects and technical aspects and challenges that you've run into related to that. If you have any comments about those, we'd love to see those. And thank you, Janelle, by the way, for your comments in the last section as well. But what have you run into related to, especially the adaptive ones? Since Scott was just saying about 70% of your time is often best spent in the adaptive aspects of your coalition. What have you run into? Okay, if you think of any comments, let us know. Because we, like I said, we'll have more of an open line later, and we'd love to hear what you've run into or what you've learned as you've gone along in your coalition work. The second part of this webinar is going to be spent focusing on planning and preparing for just natural transitions that many of your coalitions will go through or have gone through. Some of you have let us know that you've gone through some of these. And we know that coalitions comprise of a lot of different people from a lot of different organizations and sectors, and for one reason or another, people may need to lead your coalition. And what's especially important, though, is that you're considering now rather than later those key coalition stakeholders who are really central to your long-term sustainability, or maybe central to your networking capabilities. They bring that skill. And you might want to think about just how do you sustain the leadership team and sustain those kind of key stakeholder positions over time. And it's especially relevant when something happens and you find out suddenly that someone's leaving. And you realize, oh, crap, what are we going to do with that person leaving our coalition? It doesn't matter whether they're leaving due to an unfortunate accident, retirement, illness, they're moving, whatever. But probably many of us can relate to a situation where we thought, oh no, what do we do now? So let's look at a scenario. And by the way, you should have these scenarios. I'm looking at scenario 2 that was sent to you. And in this scenario, we're talking about the Jackson County Health and Wellness Coalition, who has been working well together in their community for the last 14 years. And some of you can probably relate to this idea that you have a key coalition member who's been very active, and for the last, in this case, the last 8 years. And this person is very active, heavily involved in lots of different committees and the work that your coalition is doing. In this case, Cynthia in the Jackson Coalition. And Cynthia has had a pretty key role on this coalition in helping sustain their work. And she's just that type that rolls up her sleeves and gets things done really easily. So frequently when there are next steps, she's available. She's willing to do a lot of the work for the coalition, not that she's doing it all. But she's also realizing, wow, I've been taking on a lot over time, and it's probably not a good idea that she's doing so much of the work. So just last month, in Cynthia's case, she found out her husband received word about an opportunity of a lifetime that's going to force them to move. And they're moving to North Carolina in this case. So by the end of this month, so I just want you to put yourself in this coalition situation, Cynthia's leaving your coalition by the end of this month. And there's only one more coalition meeting scheduled. So I just want you to think about how you would respond to the news of Cynthia leaving. And what, now that you're in that place, what do you wish you had taken care of prior to now? So now you're going to have to scramble to take care of these things. And then what do you need to get into place in order to have the most smooth transition possible with her leaving? So again, our hope is that you would have done this work beforehand, but many of us haven't and don't. And so let's talk about it. What do we do now? So I would like to put up a poll to just have us look as a larger group about how many of you actually have the current written succession plan in place for any of the key positions of your coalition. So Adrienne, can you open that poll? Let's just see, where are we at? Where are we starting from? So far, vast majority is saying no, which is kind of what we run into in all of the coalition and nonprofit work that we do. It's not unusual. If you're sitting in the no camp, do not have those things written down. And those of you who are in the yes camp, thank you for putting some of that knowledge and doing some work prior to these types of succession may happen. I'm not sure how many of you had to do that because of a previous succession and you learned from that, but we'll see here in a little bit. So Adrienne, I'm going to consider that we have about 80% of our group said no and 20% said yes. So good, we know where we're at. So a second question I have for you is, do you have written position descriptions for your coordinator of your coalition or the coalition members?
that question is getting at, you have real clarity for people who are part of your coalition or for your coalition coordinator and what they are supposed to be doing. Let's look at where you're at there. And there may be a difference for some of you that maybe you have kind of a general coalition description, but maybe not for your coordinator. So we can find that out when people visit with us as well. So I'm seeing that about 60% of you have something written down, and whether that's maybe 65, something written down, and whether it's your coordinator versus your coalition members. I'm glad that you're taking those steps to have things in writing for people. So to follow up on that, of the 55% of you that said yes, that I have something, or we have something written down, the next polling question I want to know is, when was the last time that that description was updated? So you can choose between, if I can scroll and get caught up here. There we go. You can choose between within the last year, we've never updated it, or we really haven't created it yet. Or for those of you who haven't created it yet, just mark that you haven't created it. Okay, so we've got, yeah, so not quite half of you have said that within the last year you've updated those descriptions, which is great. For those of you who wrote them down, if it's not updated yet, so this may be a good cue for you, and then the other 36% that you haven't created them yet, you're going to get some great examples and good questions to ask yourself to start getting those positions and tasks written down. So my next question is related to those examples that we might have. Again, many of you have been through transitions, whether it's been on this coalition or other community coalitions you've been a part of. And I just want to think about, what was helpful to have in place and to help that transition go as smoothly as possible. And then what are some of the things you learned the hard way? Because you didn't have information written down, or for some other reason. What was it that you really learned in the situations that made it easy and smooth, and then what made it hard? And there were a couple of people who have volunteered to help us out on this question. And for those of you who didn't necessarily volunteer, please don't feel like you're excluded from this conversation. But I am going to open up the mic for Vicki and for Lori. Let me find you over here on our list. So Vicki and Lori, you're both unmuted. And so Vicki's from the Abilene Coalition and Lori's from Reno County. So Vicki or Lori, can we hear from you just about your experiences?
Sure, no problem. This is Lori. I'm from Harpy County, actually, not Reno County.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that.
One of the things that I think helps successions go well and just transitions is having a written history of the coalition, having good records. What have you done? What haven't you done? So that you're not just like spinning your wheels in one place and you're actually advancing. And then also having the clear roles and expectations for the coalition members so that everyone knows if one person goes away, the entire structure doesn't go away. I've had coalitions that have done that where one person left and the coalition just dissolved because no one knew what had been done, what hadn't been done, who was supposed to be doing what, so it just dissolved. And then I've had the coalitions that have had clear roles, they've had bylaws, they've had expectations for all the coalition members, and someone steps out and the next person steps in and just keeps rolling right along. So that's my examples of transitions, is the ones that they don't have anything written down. They don't have a history. They don't have bylaws. They don't have the coordinator's roles written down. They don't have the coalition members' roles written down. And when someone steps out, it just dissolves because it was a structure built on one person's shoulders as opposed to on a coalition's shoulders.
Right. Boy, so potentially all that hard work that was done, people sort of lost their sense of purpose and where are we at and where are we headed just by one person leaving.
Yeah, and it was almost always the situation of, oh, well, X takes care of that. Well, that's what X does. That's what X does. Well, then X isn't there anymore. And, well, that's what no one does.
Yeah.
That may be considered a red flag for coalitions. I've never thought of it this way, but during coalition meetings, if the same person or two's name comes up as that's X person's job, that's X person's job, that could be a red flag for the coalition just to assess itself. Wow, we're highly dependent on X person. So.
Yeah.
I know I've also heard some of you in our TA calls talk about how the coalition does a really great job of giving the coordinator things to do, as opposed to the rest of the coalition members doing things. And so that puts a lot of weight and pressure onto one person. And so what else?
Well, this is speaking from Quality of Life Coalition in Dickinson County, and I have to agree with Lori. The history, when we stepped in here, I had no one here with historical knowledge, and so we were scrambling, even trying to find a list of the key partners, trying to get ourselves familiar with the grant. And with that, the succession planning was that I have would have been very beneficial is if you have one common place that you have all of those important documents, such as the bylaws, any recorded history that there might be, your 501c3 original documents, action that had been done on the grant with the coalition members, reporting that was done, to have one common place that you have all of those very important documents. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing was the computer files. We were, Michelle and I were just searching everywhere on computers trying to find information and lists. And it would have been, what would have been helpful, and these are areas that I'm trying to move us into now, is to have a common place that everything that has to do with the coalition is all in this one single file. Maybe you have different files in there, but have a master file that's easy to be documented. And then have that recorded in a procedure manual. That what you have, where you recorded some of those very important documents. Because a lot of times it's not just that you think you're going to be gone, it is that emergency plan. It's if you have a fire or a tornado or something like that too. You never know what's going to happen. It just takes you out of the office and away immediately, and so somebody else is going to need to step in.
Yeah, even the backup in case something happens. Yeah.
And to follow up on that, one coalition I had many years ago was part of the leadership, the actual housing of the grant switched from one organization, one company to another company, and they couldn't transfer the files over. So I always have a 3-ring binder with everything printed out into it physically so that when those computer files don't work, you have it.
Boy, we'd like to count on the technology, wouldn't we? But sometimes good old paper.
Yeah, and one thing I put in place here that we just did a couple months ago is, I don't know if anybody has heard of the Microsoft 365, but they have a special program for nonprofits. And this way, everything can get stored basically in the cloud. And then no matter where we're at, so if we're at home working or I'm at a conference somewhere, we have access to those files.
Yeah.
And that has been very beneficial already to us.
Yeah. And I don't think it's that expensive either, from my
Oh,
experience.
that's the other thing, yes. Yeah, actually, you can get one free. You go in to Microsoft Office 365 for nonprofits. You have to verify your eligibility. And you also need to own your domain. That's another problem, too, that we had. But you can request a trial. And ours, we picked, gives us the whole Microsoft Office suite. We can install it up to 5 computers, and it's $4 a month. It's wonderful. But with that, too, as you're documenting things, something that we ran into here was not knowing anything about who had our domain, you know, who owned our domain on our websites. I mean, there was just, and then we found out it was actually owned by a family member of the past director, and so we just had a lot of complexities in getting things changed and trying to work so that all of our systems are sustainable without dependency on some individual, you know, so that whoever steps in here, it's documented and they can basically go in and make changes to the domain by contacting that carrier or get their own. But that was quite a challenge for us, too.
Yes. Great. Wow. Vicki and Lori, thank you so much for those comments. I'm hearing a lot of ideas, and some of you may be thinking, well, gosh, that sounds more like a nonprofit director and the stuff that should be in place for a nonprofit. But I guess the encouragement to you is to think about your coalition as though it sort of needs to think like a nonprofit. So that in case our nonprofit director were to leave, you know, what would you want to have in place there? And it's honestly not that much different for your coalition when you think about a long-term sustainability for the coalition. So you guys brought up things like written history, which is important and, you know, specific for our purposes to the HCI grant. You know, where is the grant, by the way, and what are we supposed to be doing on it, and what have we done so far? Who are our key partners and coalition members, and how do we find them and get a hold of them? And then the technical aspects of documentation and where that's kept and who has access to it and how do you back it up and all of that. I think those are really great thoughts. So thank you very much for being willing to share those. And I'll try to mute you guys back.
Also, and Tom Keller, I think one of your responses here, I'm not too sure if you're responding to this scenario or the previous one, but this notion of polling members, and if I understand your comment correctly, with Cynthia in scenario 2 taking so much of the work, there may have been just people saying, well, if she's doing the work, I don't need to do the work. And some folks may have even felt challenged or put off by that a bit, saying, well, if she's going to do it all, we'll just let her, and hesitant to assume those roles. So it seemed like your comment was polling or asking members who may have been waiting in the wings for those types of opportunities that now present themselves with her departure.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Tom. So along with the webinar information, you received these other handouts, and my hope is that you can pull the emergency succession plan questions and a plan template up if you want to refer to those. I'm going to walk through some of these plan questions just so you can be thinking about it. I'm going to give you just a little bit of time in each of these sections to jot a couple of notes down. Not a lot of time, but I just want you to pretend that you are now starting to write your emergency succession plan down. And if you already have one, this is a great opportunity then to look at what do we need to update, or maybe there's pieces of your plan that you didn't think about yet and want to include. So some things that we hope you don't have to write this now because there's an emergency going on, by the way. But let's think about some key things that you would probably want to have in place if a key coalition member was to leave, especially your coalition coordinator, and the documents that you were sent are, the wording is worded so that you might think about if your coalition coordinator position was vacated for some reason. So let's go back to Lori and Vicki's comments about the role. One of the things you want to think about is, what does the coordinator do? What are some of the priority functions of this coordinator? And by revisiting it every year, you're more in tune with, well, is the job description or the list of tasks that this person normally takes care of, is it up to date? All of us have been in positions where we know our job description says one thing, and then what we actually end up doing day to day might vary quite a bit. And so you just want to make sure that somebody coming into a position like a coordinator, new to that position, could actually jump on board and do what you need them to do. So you want to make sure that you have a list of the types of tasks that that person does, and it's, even better is an always updated job description for that person. Another thing to think about, and we can refer back to the case of the Jackson Health and Wellness Coalition and Cynthia leaving, is if Cynthia were to leave, who's the backup? Do you naturally work with your leadership team to develop capacity past Cynthia, so that if she were to leave, somebody could naturally either step into the position as a whole, or that you have been working with others to kind of cross-train them to step into certain job tasks as opposed to the whole position. So another possibility in a transition may be that people share a position for a while until such time as you know if the person is coming back or not, the person that was in the coordinator position is coming back. But if you can have those key functions or key roles filled, at least temporarily, and somebody's already trained to do that, then you can see how that would make that transition seamless. So the cross-training thing or idea, or having a plan for that, is important to think about. And then for those of you who, especially if it's a short-term, unexpected, that the person's coming back into the role, is there compensation for that position or for that somebody to step in? That may not be a big deal for some people. A lot of times you have coalition members who, because by virtue of volunteering for things like this, they're willing to step in, and it's not something they're looking to be paid to do. But you might want to consider for your coalition if you have dollars attached to certain jobs. So what do you do in the case of somebody who's temporarily in a position during a transition? And then also somebody who's stepping into a coordinator role, who do they answer to? And then also, who do they get help from? So what is the support system built around somebody in a key position like that? The next set of questions that's listed on the handout has to do with communication. And mostly this is to help you think about, who do you talk to when there's a transition? Who needs to get the message that there's a transition in place, whether it's a short-term, temporary, or a long-term? And then what's the message that we need to communicate to people? So having a communications plan allows you to get clear with who are like our foundation program officers, who are our government partners, excuse me, that we might need to communicate with, or civic or organizational decision makers if you think of your community change framework. All the people in those different segments of the community change framework, there's probably some key people in each of those that needs to be notified of this either temporary or permanent transition. Do you have some major donors or community members who have been just champions for the work? And, do they need to know about this? What about the media? Who are your media partners that might need to be contacted? And then I have an other category that you might list some specific people or organizations in your community that aren't really captured on these other options. And list them now so that you know they won't be left out. And then really key to this whole communications plan idea is, what's the message? So you may not know the exact message until the time comes that you need to get one out. But what is the message that's going to be sent to these people, or if you're calling them to let them know, and who does it. So you want to have a unified message then, and who's responsible for getting that message out.
I've seen this happen, examples of this happening really well, and people taking advantage of the change as a way to engage in communication, particularly with the media, and celebrating somebody moving into a new role, as well as celebrating maybe what somebody has accomplished in that role as well. And so it sometimes can also be a missed opportunity where coalitions kind of just look inwardly and don't think, oh, there's a whole world going on around us that may need to know about what steps we're taking during this transition. And so I've seen and heard of examples of people going, well, do you know what's going on with the coalition, or do you know what's going on with that nonprofit? Well, I haven't heard anything. And there just becomes this buzz in the community of, I don't know what's happening. And so I've seen both examples play out where coalitions have taken it as an opportunity to engage with the media and have a communication plan in place, and it goes well. They capitalize on it, and other times where it kind of flounders, and it's almost a missed opportunity for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to stop here for a second and respond to some comments on there. So, like Chris, you're noting that you may not have a written succession plan necessarily, but people who are in your work groups or teams have some titles. They at least have some authority titles. So maybe getting some clarity around their roles and what they're responsible for could be helpful. And Susan, saying that you've run into newer people who may not be as comfortable participating meaningfully right away. I don't know if having those types of plans in place gives them more information to know where they can plug in and how. And then Tom, I think your comment about what's the expected timeline for Cynthia's successor, it would be helpful to know how long the coalition can subsist on having temporary people put in place or people taking over those tasks for Cynthia for a while. When you write a succession plan or an emergency succession plan, you can be specific about the time frame. So you could include some of the things you want to have in place if someone was going to be temporarily out of their position. Let's say that they had maybe a bicycle accident or something and they had to be out for a couple of months. And so you can have a plan that said if it's 3 months or less, then here's what would happen. And then you can have a plan, the plan could continue to say if the position is going to be vacant for 3 to 6 months or so, then here's how we would handle it. If you're looking at past 6 months, it's really difficult for coalitions to exist in any kind of smooth way without having someone step into that key role. So you probably don't want to have a temporary or emergency succession plan that's going to last in a position longer than 6 months. And for some of you, 3 months will be painful. So I might encourage you to think about maybe a 3-month mark. But just be clear in what you write. And that template that got included gives you some other wording to consider if you wanted to have different sections in your succession plan that relate to the timing of a succession. So there are other things that are listed on that plan related to questions to ask. And again, Lori and Vicki were kind in sharing with us that they've learned probably the hard way about some of these other things that you may or may not have thought about that you really want to have written down. So some things like the history. It's really important to capture institutional and coalition knowledge about what's happened so far and tying that to any funding sources and responsibilities that you have as funders, what you're supposed to be doing and what you have done. So, you know, what are our current grants? What's been done on those? What are the requirements? Who are important community partners related to those grants? Do you have an annual calendar of any activities that the coalition does on a yearly basis or even quarterly basis? Because again, somebody stepping into a position, if they knew that in 2 months I have to get this grant report out, and here are some examples of that previous grant report, that just makes it so much easier for them to do that work. And then we heard also like the meeting minutes who keeps those? And if it's somebody that's not your coalition coordinator, does the person who does keep them get them sent to the coordinator or to the correct person? And are those meeting minutes kept in one place so that anybody could find them if they needed to? And I love Vicki's idea of the Microsoft 365. Some of you, I know, put them on SharePoint. Some of you might use the box. I'm losing the name of the box. Anyway, some sort of cloud. Where you can keep those notes and people who have permission can access that. I think it's important to think about. And then one of you noted, who owns the website domain? What if I needed to manage the website because it's our coalition's responsibility? How do I get in there? Who do I ask for help? I have known a coalition who had somebody that was doing a lot of financial work for them, and they had accounting work but nobody knew where the password was to the accounting software. So how are you going to take care of anything like that? Listing previous and current donors, and then find other financial records, I guess, related to the accounting. Who's keeping the accounting records or financial records, and where are they, and what are any of our other financial responsibilities? Do we have rent due on a building if we have one, or a space, maybe an office space? Do we have a copier that is leased, and who do we lease that from, and when do we pay for that? And who do I ask when I have questions about any of this kind of stuff? So there's so much to think about that, the business as usual types of items, I think, is where people can get stuck and burn a lot of time in trying to figure out who do I go to and where do I find that kind of information. So I am curious if anybody has any comments or questions about any of the items that I just talked about on succession planning ideas, especially like an emergency succession plan. So if you have any of those types of comments, you might plug those into the chat box, and we'll try to get to those. Or about the worksheet in general, the template. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions at this time, but it might be helpful for us to open up lines to see if anybody does have any questions or that they want to ask, or get some feedback from other people who are also on the call. So we
can try.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and unmute you.
We're going to try to
unmute. Okay. No.
So if you know you have a question, will you please put it in the chat box until we can get people unmuted?
All right, so your lines are all unmuted for those of you that are calling in via telephone, so you're able to answer, ask questions.
Anybody that's on the phone?
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Chris, again from Lawrence Douglas County.
Hi, Chris.
I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but certainly I think in looking at your ideas around succession planning, I do think that in a coalition where you have a lot of complexity, a lot of partners involved, we have looked at ways to create more decentralized models around communication, i.e. involving more of the coalition members in that process of communication. And that certainly, I think, has been one of our greatest challenges is, how do you decentralize some of that responsibility but still A, maintain kind of a consistent voice, and B, maintain kind of consistency and quality of communications across the coalition. So I don't think we figured it out yet.
Okay. What does a decentralized model look like?
Well, as an example, we've got 5 or 6 really active work groups at this point in time.
Right.
We as a health department kind of coordinate the coalition, but certainly, on a day-to-day basis, as those groups meet or as they have subgroups that meet, you mentioned minutes. I mean, simply ensuring that there's kind of consistent, collection of information like minutes and attendance lists, and then sharing out that information. We've tried to decentralize that by creating some communication positions within those work groups. And honestly, that hasn't worked real well yet. There's a lot of variability kind of in quality because we've got a lot of volunteer members who are volunteering their time, and the communications piece is one that just takes a lot of time and effort. So it's been a real challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anybody else? Are there any ahas coming up for anyone that you're thinking about in relation to hearings about maybe we need to have a succession plan or more specific plans in place?
I think it is a challenge. Chris, when I look at the various coalitions that we've worked with, I think the example of Live Well Lawrence is because if you got it right, you really want to give the work back to the people who are doing the work, right? So the responsibility should not be, so it should be decentralized. And,
right.
And so it becomes a bit of a challenge. Because I know some of the players that are leaders in several of the work groups in Lawrence, at least, and I imagine if some of them all of a sudden left, that there might be a little bit of a challenge around how to reestablish the work that has already been planned. So that is a bit of a challenge. And I imagine it varies between community and community a lot. Yeah.
I was just going to comment. I think it's easy to energize people around the work, but creating, kind of a consistent vehicle for communicating back, what is the work that we are doing and how is that impacting the health of the community. I think that's, for us, that just has been probably the most challenging thing. We've got a lot of, great community leaders who are engaged in doing the work, and so that seems to be less of a factor, engaging them and motivating them, but creating a consistent process to then feed that information back across the coalition and to the community is a real challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Anybody else? You're all unmuted if you have other thoughts about
those that can be.
Of those that can be. Yeah. If you have any thoughts, this is your time to kind of network with each other around these ideas.
And if you dialed in via your computer, feel free to leave a comment in the question box.
Is the chat box, we can't see the chat box anymore. I wonder if you raise that up. Is it below there? I wondered if people were...
Yeah, sorry, we lost our chat box.
It doesn't look like anybody's chat anyway. So good. Okay.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions from people. But I would encourage you, if you think of questions after the webinar, to reach out to Scott or to me and let us consider what you're up against and how we might be able to help give you some assistance creating a succession plan, whether it's just a shorter emergency one or a longer term, or in talking through transitions and what your leadership team can do to make those as smooth as possible. So we're available and open to talking with you. So thank you.
Look forward to seeing you in October.
And just a couple of other quick announcements. As was mentioned earlier, the webinar will be recorded and posted on SharePoint within the next several days. You'll also be receiving via email a link for a short survey to obtain your feedback about the webinar. We really value your opinion and insight, so look forward to getting your comments there. And we'll use that information to plan for the next webinar scheduled for November 12th at noon. The semi-monthly reporting forms are due September 15th, and we are also looking forward to seeing several of you at the HCI dinner at the Built Environment Outdoor Summit on September 16th. And finally, as Jeff said, the October convening is scheduled for October 2nd and 3rd, and we look forward to seeing you there. And we trust that you know, if you're ever faced with an oh no moment in your coalition, that Joyce and Scott have provided some valuable feedback. So thank you for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.